All right, welcome everyone. I'm going to throw up a quick poll question here while everyone starts to sign on and get comfortable. All right, there it is. Can you confirm that you guys see the poll question on your end?
I can see it. Yep.
See it? Okay, perfect. All right, well, everyone starts to trickle in. We're really excited that you're all joining us today. Take a moment to let us know what prompted you to join our webinar, whether it's educational for project research. If you have no idea where you're at, maybe stick around. You might learn something, or maybe you are currently a prevalent customer. You'll see a couple of faces joining me. As you can see here, we are joined with Dr. Eric Cole. He is the founder and executive leader at Secure Anchor Consulting and former CTO of McAfee and chief scientist for Lockheed Martin. Eric is an industry thought leader and well known to many for the security space. So we are very pleased that he is joining us today. And I'm sure a lot of you, as you're coming in, have either spoke with him before or know a little bit more about Dr. Eric Cole. And we are also joined by our very own VP of Product Marketing, Scott Lang. You'll hear a little bit more from Scott towards the end of the session as he shares more about Prevalent, but we're again so happy that you're here. My name is Amy Tweed. I'm in business development here at Prevalent, and I am here to field any questions that you may have. So throughout the webinar, if any questions come up or concerns or comments, you can use the Q&A function or the chat function on the Zoom here. And as you all know, this is recorded. So if you have to hop off, you're not able to stay for the whole thing, it'll be sent to your inbox first thing tomorrow. So you can check it out when you are ready. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Eric Cole. Thanks, everyone.
Amy, thank you so much. And thank you everyone joining us today. I sort of laugh at the topic because if you've done anything in cybersecurity, if you've watched the news, had a computer, third-party risk management, I don't think needs any introduction. So if we go to the next slide, just in terms of recent events from SolarWinds to Kaseya, this is basically the new battleground that we're seeing from an attack perspective. And just to sort of paint the perspective, what I'm seeing out there is this activity of breaking into organizations over the internet has basically in the last 9 to 12 months have essentially commercialized cyber criminal activity. These are no longer individuals. I know I'm dating myself here using the term script kiddie, right? So some of us could recognize that as one of the original terms in the late 90s, early 2000s of essentially really smart folks after school or college hacking into systems. What we're seeing now is businesses. These are organized businesses that, like many of our businesses, are employees. They have office buildings, they have benefits, they have vacation. The only difference is their revenue generating activity is cyber criminal activity. And what they figured out is third-party vendors is the trick and magic to exponentially increase revenue, to basically reach out to more customers and get in touch with more people, once again, for nefarious activity. But why should I go in and try to break into one company when I could go in and find a vendor that supplies software to not only that target, but 20, 30, 40 other targets? And now I break into that one third-party vendor, compromise their software, let them do the work for us, and distribute it out to all of our customers. And then we just go in, activate our malicious code, activate our backdoor, and boom, we've now just broke into 40 customers by targeting one entity and one piece of software. Now, this concept of compromising and going after vendors is not new. We actually saw a preview of this approximately 6 or 7 years ago with the Target breach. If we all remember the Target breach, that was caused because a HVAC, I always got a smile and it just cracks me up when I talk about it, but a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning vendor, basically a vendor that controls the climate in all their stores, had full access to every point of sale register and therefore every credit card transaction across all of the Target stores. Now, in that particular case, they broke into a third party and they targeted one entity, one company, in that case, Target, which at the time was one of the largest breaches. What we then saw with SolarWinds is mainly focusing on government and a few commercial entities. They went in and said, okay, here's all of our targets. Imagine putting it in a spreadsheet and saying, what's the software that they all run? And then saying which of these pieces of software are the easiest to break into, target, go after that, and use that as a mechanism to compromise a significant number of entities. Then, of course, we saw Colonial, which was large-scale ransomware. Then recently, in the last few weeks, essentially, if you could take SolarWinds and Colonial and merge them together, on one of the webinars I was doing is if the SolarWinds attack and the Colonial attack basically started dating, got married, and had a baby, right, it would be Kaseya. And everyone sort of said, that was really weird. So I won't actually, oops, I actually did say it on this webinar, right? But essentially Kaseya was the merging of those two where you had a massive supply chain. In this case, it was interesting because they did a double whammy. They not only went after Kaseya, which is a vendor, but it's 4 MSSPs, managed system security providers, that each then have thousands of customers. So imagine this, I break into Kaseya and put backdoors in the software. It then goes out to all the MSSPs, level 1, and attacks them. Then all the MSSPs clients are then attacked. So when you're talking about well-planned, executed, and well-thought attacks, that's what they're doing. They have very clever business plans. And in this case, it was a ransomware attack. And once again, wholesale discount, right? When Kaseya first happened, they went to each of the individual customers and basically said, hey, you each have to pay a ransom. Then they went back to the MSSPs and said, listen, instead of all of your hundreds of customers having to pay a ransom, we'll give you a volume discount. If you just give us a lump sum payment, right, we'll then go in and let all your customers have their data back. So this is, whether we like it or not, the new normal, the new battleground. And if you're focusing on cybersecurity for an organization, whether you're a security engineer, a CISO, or you're running a SOC, you need to make sure that you understand and are careful of the third-party vendors. As we used to say at the CIA, trust no one, admit nothing, and make counter accusations. And if we go to the next slide, one of the rules, and I've been in cybersecurity for a long time, I know many of you have been taking my courses, it's all about managing risk. It's all about balancing the risk. Yes, we do need vendors to have access to our environment, but where's the balance between the functionality and the security? Where do we find that proper mix? And to me, it's always great to go back to the fundamentals. And one of my favorite questions whenever I do webinars is I always love asking the audience, what is cybersecurity? What is the definition of cybersecurity? If you came home from work today and a neighbor, a friend, one of your kids said, what did you do today? And you said, I attended the most amazing presentation on cybersecurity I've ever seen in the entire world, right? And they look at you and go, what's cybersecurity? What would be your answer? And I love this because I know brilliant people that have worked in cybersecurity for 15 plus years. And when I ask them, please define in one sentence or less, what is cybersecurity? They can't do it. They're like, well, you know, securing stuff, right? Well, you know, cybersecurity stuff. And I'm like, no, what is the actual definition? So here it is. And it's very important because it lays out what we're trying to accomplish in any area, especially dealing with third-party risk. Cybersecurity is all about understanding, managing, and mitigating the risk of our critical data being disclosed, altered, or denied access. So when we're looking at cybersecurity, we're really going in and looking at 3 things. Risk management. What is the probability of loss? We're balancing risk. We're saying, what do we gain? What do we lose? And what's the proper trade-off? It all comes down to our critical data. Because let's face it, If somebody broke in and they didn't access critical data or critical business processes, we would call that a minor breach, right? It wouldn't be a concern and it wouldn't be an issue. What goes from a minor breach that nobody hears about to a major breach that is all over the news and everybody is talking about is when significant amount of critical data and critical business processes are involved with the attack. And then, of course, it comes down to what we call our CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And that's coming down. Confidentiality is preventing, detecting unauthorized disclosure. Integrity is dealing with alteration. And availability is dealing with denial of access. So we're trying to protect our critical data from unauthorized disclosure, alteration, or denial of access. Now, what's interesting with that is most folks that have worked in cybersecurity for a long time, traditionally the main focus in cyber was always on the disclosure, making sure somebody can't get access to our critical data, which is important. And when you have third parties that are assessing your environment, you want to make sure that you're protecting the disclosure. But of course, now with ransomware, the denial of access is also becoming a very big concern factor. So you need to go in and say, okay, what is our critical data and business processes that support it? Who should or shouldn't have access? And what can we do to minimize or reduce that overall exposure in that organization? And the one thing we have to always remember when we're dealing with risk, next slide, is that in any practical sense, 100% security really doesn't exist. I remember I was getting back on stage about 6 weeks ago. Of course, with COVID for the last 14 months, everything was virtual. I basically lived in the studio, and my team has a little slit in the door, like a prison door where they slip me food and beverages. But I live here all day giving presentations, podcasts, seminars, because we couldn't go on stage. And about 6 weeks ago, I got to go back on my first live stage, which is awesome. I love interaction, people, energy. That it's good to have remote, but you still can't get that. And I remember I'm giving my first live speech in over 14 months. And there was a slide that said 100% security doesn't exist. Now, I've given this presentation and I've used that slide probably over 40 or 50 times. But on this particular occasion, I don't know why I questioned it. I sort of looked at the slide. I looked back at the audience and I said, is that really true? Is it true that we cannot achieve 100% security? So I held up my cell phone and I said, can we make this 100% secure? And somebody screamed out, well, turn it off. And I said, great. So I turn it off. And somebody says, well, you can turn it back on. So another person screams out, smash it to pieces. And I said, great. If I turn it off and smash it to pieces, have we achieved 100% security? And I kid you not, there was a person in the third row and he's like, you can glue it back together. And I'm like, really? We're really going to go there, right? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, so what do we need to do, sir? And he's like, well, pour lighter fluid on it and light it on fire. And he got almost a little too excited. It was a little freaky. So I said, great. If I take my cell phone and I turn it off and I smash it to pieces and I burn those pieces to a crisp, can we all agree that that cell phone is now 100% secure? Everyone agreed. I said, excellent. I said, okay, what's the problem when we achieve 100% security? There's zero functionality. Zero. So yes, we can technically achieve 100% security, but then that has zero value or zero device, which means when we want to go in and add functionality, you're never going to be 100% secure. So I just want to make sure we recognize that we're dealing with third parties. The only way to make third parties 100% secure is not allow any of them to connect to our network, not allow any of them to access any of our systems. Well, I think we all agree that if we ran an organization where no vendor, no software, and no entity could have any access to any of our network or any of our systems, we wouldn't be able to function. We wouldn't be able to run the organization. So here's the most important part: the law of security. The law of security is just like the law of gravity. Whether you like it or not, whether you accept it or not, it's always at play. You can sit there and say, I don't believe in the law of gravity. And if you walk off a 10-story building, guess what? You will meet gravity very, very quickly. All right. So whether you like it or not, whether you accept it or not, gravity is always at play. And the same thing with law of security. You don't have to like it. You don't have to acknowledge it, but the law of security is always at play. And here's the law. Whenever you're adding functionality, you're reducing security. Whenever you add functionality, you're increasing risk. Our job as cybersecurity professionals is to go in and balance it, is to go in and say, okay, by having a third party have access to our network, what is the functionality that's needed, and how can we minimize and reduce that risk to an acceptable level? To me, we're going back to one of the core foundational principles, which is least privilege. How can we give entities the least amount of access they need to do their jobs? However, this means we have to start doing analysis. The way some, not all. So if you're one of those folks that go, no, Eric, we're doing all of this great. I didn't say all, I said some or most, not all organizations, when they go in and buy a new piece of software, they set up a new relationship with a third party. What do? They assume they're secure. They directly connect them to the private network, and they give them full access to their environment. And I see this all the time. So we'll cover this in more detail as I continue my presentation, but I just want to give you the 3 big risk areas when we're talking about third parties and vendors. First, figure out what access they really need. What is the minimal amount of access they require in order to do their jobs? Only give them that access and manage and monitor to reduce or minimize the risk. So I remember when I first started teaching one of the courses I wrote, Security Essentials, that at the time was one of the #1 selling cybersecurity courses. When we taught the firewall module, I always had a simple rule. Golden rule of firewalls. All external connections must go through a firewall. All external connections must be monitored, tracked, and analyzed. And let's face it, a third party vendor is an external connection. So we need to make sure that we're filtering it. So once again, solid cybersecurity principles. You go in and do a default deny. So you put it behind a firewall, don't allow any access. Then, because that's zero functionality, we figure out what access is needed and we only allow that access. We only put that minimal amount of access through that firewall. So I always find when I give these presentations, I'll often get back going, Eric, basically everything you said is sort of things that we've known about in cybersecurity and is common sense. And my response is, and I see this in a lot of areas, but it is so true in cybersecurity. Common sense is not common practice. You can sit there and tell me filtering and not allowing third-party vendors to have full access to your environment is common sense. But if you look at SolarWinds and Kaseya and many of the others, it wasn't common practice. It wasn't something that was put into play. So next slide, please. So we want to make sure that when we're going in, you actually understand what's happening and what software is in your environment. If you're a cybersecurity professional, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a team of one, whether you're a chief information security officer, let me ask you a simple question. When was the last time you talked to contracts? When was the last time you talked to legal? When was the last time you signed off on a vendor contract for software or hardware to your organization? Especially with the migration to the cloud, which was greatly accelerated because of the pandemic, the role of cybersecurity is drastically changing. It is moving from a very technical role that we saw 10, 15, 20 years ago, where the security team was really responsible for setting up the firewalls, filtering, tracking, monitoring. And now it's much more of a strategic role where you're interfacing with contracts, with legal, and making sure that there's proper security language in all those contracts. I review a lot of contracts for our clients, and I'm amazed. Big companies that you would know of, Fortune 100 to small companies, they're signing very, very significant multi-million-dollar contracts. And there's no security language. There's no security metrics. There's no security expectations. And heck, security is not even involved in that process at all. But wait a second. If we're purchasing software and we're giving vendors access to our network, shouldn't there be cybersecurity language in the contracts? Shouldn't we have an accountability clause? Shouldn't we have clear metrics and components in place? So when we're talking about third-party risk, you can't protect what you don't know. So the first and most important component is cybersecurity needs to build a relationship with legal and contracts. So if that's not something you're doing, you need to set that up. Next, you need to have a referenced architecture. Because let's face it, there are going to be vendors that are going to need access to your environment. You're going to have to allow them in. So shouldn't you have a standard way of doing that? Shouldn't you have standard operating procedures? If every vendor is allowed to connect and is treated as an exception, your environment becomes an exception-based environment and you can't protect that. So you want to have a referenced architecture. And what we do with our clients is, it is something the vendor has to sign off on. Because if we're going to go in and let a vendor come in, here's our reference architecture, here's what we allow, here's what we don't allow. Can you work within that? And if the vendor says no, then we look for another vendor. But here's the problem. If security engages too late, one of the golden rules of security you have to always remember. If security negatively impacts the business, security is wrong. So if you're thinking of going in and purchasing a $2 million piece of software and security says, wait a second, this is too big a risk, too big an exposure, here's some other options, the business unit will listen, or they should listen if you're doing it correctly. But if they already wrote a check, if the company already spent $2 million and the vendor is there to install it, that train is going down the track. And if you try to get in front of it, you're going to get run over. You need to get in front of that train when it's stopped at the station. So you need to engage early and let them know these risks are unacceptable. Because once the check's been written and the software's been purchased, too little, too late, and the exposure is too big. So next slide. So you want to make sure that when you're going in, that you're covering some of the key areas. So now as I start to wrap up my section, I sort of have the what's hot and what's not, right? Areas, sort of the 5 key things to pay attention to. So first, what's hot today in the last several, and some of this stuff is the last couple of months. Some of this started after SolarWinds, and some of this started just after Kaseya. This is like hot off the press. What's hot today is heavy segmenting and filtering connections from all third parties. Highly segmented environments. Essentially going back and learning the lesson from Target. After the Target breach happened, we actually, and we still today, have a huge retail market for my company. Essentially what we did after Target is we went into large number of retail organizations, and at every one of their stores, we dropped in a switch that essentially segmented the store from every other store and put every register known as a POS, a point of sale system, on every isolated segment. So now, even if somebody breaks into headquarters, they can't get into the store. And if somebody breaks in to the store, they can't actually get into registers. And if they get into one register, they only have one, not all. So this idea of highly segmenting and filtering is very important. And to me, I always laugh because in cybersecurity, we love coming up with really clever names. And most of the time, it's things that we've been doing for a long time. So like this idea of zero trust network, right? And people always go, Eric, what do you think of zero trust network? I'm like, I've been teaching that for 25 years before you called it that, right? So essentially the idea is assume no trust, right? Isolate, minimize, reduce. Another way to look at zero trust, which I'm a big fan of, is least privilege. Only give an entity the least amount of access it needs to do its job. Let it do its job, but stop everything else. The problem is what we used to do, which is not hot anymore, is principle of most privilege, essentially giving you full access and trusting everyone. Now, here's the issue. It's much easier and simpler to trust everyone. Hey, just come on in. I'm going to have a party. Everyone can do anything they want on the system. But here's what you have to look at. You're going to pay the piper. You either pay now or pay later. So I always go to clients going, Eric, if we're going to go in and really start segmenting and filtering out all third-party connections, that's going to require extra work and effort whenever we bring on a new vendor. I said, great, give me a number. And they said, okay, it's going to cost us $60K. Every time we bring on a new vendor, it's going to cost us $60,000 to set them up, segment and filter that we wouldn't have to do if we trusted everyone. I said, great. How many new vendors do you bring on a year? And they say 10. And yeah, I'm using easy numbers to make the math simple. I said, okay, so you're saying that doing this highly segmented zero trust model is going to cost you about $600K a year. Great. If you don't do it based on the current threats that are out there, there's an 80% chance that you'll get compromised and you'll have to pay a $5 million ransom. And there's all data behind this. I'm not just making this up. There's data to support all of this. So now I go to the executives and I say, okay, you have two options. Option one is keep doing what you're doing. Trust everyone, doing what's not hot anymore, but keep doing that. And there's an 80% chance you'll have to pay $5 million and lose trust with your customers. Or option two is you can spend $600K now to minimize that. Which option would you like? That's the correct way to do cybersecurity. The problem is many security departments, they don't cover that first piece. So they go to their executives and they say, or they go to their vice presidents or their other departments saying, we need to spend $600K a year to secure the environment. And everybody says, well, if we don't spend $600K and we spend zero, we're safe. They're assuming something that's not true because we didn't provide the complete data set. So what's also very hot is do the complete data set. If you keep doing what you're doing today, 80% chance of 5 million. If you want to minimize that at 600K. Now, honestly, when I speak to execs, I don't care which option. If you want to accept the bigger risk, that's on you. You're the executive team. I'm just giving you the full perspective so you can understand where that's coming from. So next slide. So it's important that when you're doing your analysis, you're always presenting accurate information. And remember, you can't manage what you can't measure. We want to take cybersecurity from this ambiguous term to clear, measurable metrics and service level agreements. I go into a lot of companies. So how's your security? Good. How do you measure good? Well, what does good mean? Right? Does good mean you have an 80, a 50? I mean, what are the numbers and data sets that are there? So we need to go in and stop doing the old model, which thinks cybersecurity is only a technical role and not integrated into the business. Any business that signs a contract for anything that can impact cybersecurity, which I would argue are most things, but definitely software and hardware, you want to make sure there's clear security metrics in the contract and service level agreements. And here's what you got to do. You have to commit. I'll often go in and I'll say, okay, you have to go and say any software that's running on a common operating system, when new patches come out, you will apply that patch within 30 days. It's clear, it's measurable. Either you do it or you don't. But I always get people going, oh, but Eric, we don't want to commit because what if it should be 35 or 40? So they end up putting these things in there that you should take reasonable measures to protect software. What the bleep is reasonable measures? I mean, we got to stop playing games. We got to stop this thing where, oh, we don't want to commit or we don't want to push people too hard. Why not? We need to start measuring this. You either sign the SLA that says you will apply all patches in 30 days, or if you won't, we don't do business with you, right? We do this in other areas, right? We do this in legal. If you're not willing to follow very specific rules, they won't do contracts with you. So we have to go in and start recognizing that cybersecurity needs to be measurable with metrics and implement SLAs to protect and secure that environment. So next slide, where we go in and we start looking at the third tip. This is, once again, I work with a lot of vendors. I love vendors. Vendors solve problems. So I just want to be crystal clear here. Vendors are not the enemy. I don't want you to think, oh, Eric hates vendors or vendors hate the enemies. But we also have to remember that vendors protect their data, and it's our responsibility to protect our data. And trust me, vendors don't want the liability either. So the old model of, oh, we trust all vendors and vendors are always going to do the right thing. No, only give them the access they need. If you don't need access to all the data, don't give it to them. So what's getting very hot, and it's something that it took these big breaches to get to this level where data classification is now a new norm. So if you don't have data classification in place at your environment, and you know me well enough, I'm never going to go in and say, you must do it. Here's what I'm going to say. Look at everything that's on your current 12-month roadmap. And I want you to prove to me every one of those items is a higher priority than data classification. If you're telling me that everything you are currently doing over the next 12 months is a higher priority than data classification, don't do it. But if you can't, and you're like, no, Eric, all these items are much lower priority, data classification needs to be the top method. Look at any of these breaches. Why were they in the news? Because the data wasn't properly protected. If somebody broke in and they couldn't access your data, you wouldn't need to pay a ransom. If somebody broke in and they didn't get any sensitive information, you wouldn't have heard about it on every news channel. So the difference between major minor breaches and what we hear about in the news is not whether somebody got into an organization or not. It's the amount of critical data they got access to. It's all about protecting and securing your data. So next slide. So we need to make sure that we have good, clear mechanisms in place. The next part is you're responsible for your company's security. Stop playing the blame game. Stop going in and coming up with excuses. Stop thinking that it's the vendor's responsibility to protect your organization, that it's their priority, and if you have a breach, it's their fault. I mean, last year, I'll have to be honest with you, when the SolarWinds happened, to me, it was embarrassing. I mean, you have these big tech companies that instead of owning their security and saying, yup, our bad, lesson learned, let's move forward, it was all this blame game of, oh, the attacker was so sophisticated, or it was their problem, or and it was blaming everyone else. I'm like, own it. You're responsible for your organization's security. You should be performing security assessments on all third-party vendors. You should be going in and doing spot checks. You should have performance reports. If you're letting a vendor into your environment, they are part of your security. And you need to evaluate, assess, and determine whether they are helping or hurting your overall security. Now, if we move to the next slide, the next one is we really have to remember that prevention is ideal, but detection is a must. You are going to get breached. You are going to get compromised. And it's all about timely detection. Cybersecurity. The goal of cybersecurity, and I wish every executive understands this, the goal of cybersecurity is not to prevent all attacks. The goal of cybersecurity is not to stop all attacks. It can't be done. The goal of cybersecurity is timely detection and response. You're going to have breaches. And this idea that treating cybersecurity like accidents, illnesses, and robberies, those are things that happen to other people. They don't happen to us, just doesn't work. And as I said, I was just recently doing a live presentation. And after I got done, there was a panel discussion. And because my flight wasn't till later in the day, I stayed for the discussion. And they're going in and they're introducing the panelists. And the first person gets up and says, I'm a CISO for this organization and entity, and I just want to report. We've had no breaches and no attempted attacks over the last 24 months. And the person almost started doing like this hero thing, and you saw the audience, they want to applaud, woo, like everyone gets super excited. And I'm just sitting in the back of the room like, what is going on? And then it gets worse. The next panelist gets up there, and they sort of go like this, and they look up at the audience and they're like, we've detected 3 attacks over the last 12 months. And you almost heard like people want to boo, and this person is ashamed, and they're looking down. And I'm in the back of the room, and I have to be honest with you. This was the most galactically stupidest thing I've ever seen. The person who is arrogant and ignorant enough to claim they've had no attacks and no breaches for the last 2 years, I'd fire them on the spot. And the person that actually detected attacks in a timely manner, I would hire and give them a raise. But we still, and I was shocked, have this perception that attacks and breaches are bad. No, they're good. They're going to happen. Now, if you have a breach and you don't detect it for 2 years, bad. But if you have a breach and you detect it in 2 hours and minimize and control the damage, that's awesome. If you say you haven't had a breach and you did and you've ignored it for 2 years, bad. Right? So we need to open and recognize that attacks are going to happen, and we need to focus more on the response and work with our vendors as partners, as opposed to believing they don't happen and blaming vendors when it does happen. So now if we go to my final slide, as I mentioned, it's really about zero trust. Understanding, authenticating, verifying, and validating all connections, least privilege, least privilege, least privilege, and verify, validate, and inspect, and make sure that you understand what the risks and exposures are. And now that we've gone in, and I love doing these joint vendor podcasts because I just laid out the problem and the challenge, and now I'm going to hand it off where we could go in and look at the solution. So please, everyone rise and put your hands together as I welcome. Now, you might recognize Scott Lang. He actually starred in the original Batman movie, and today he's often called the Obi-Wan Kenobi of cybersecurity. So please put your hands together for Scott Lang. Now, Scott, you got to say that was your best intro you've ever gotten, right?
Best intro, most inaccurate, and I wish my kids were here to hear that because they'd be over the moon, especially the Batman piece. I don't know what to say about it. Ant-Man, yes. Batman, I don't know. Thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate it. Folks, you know, as we kind of consume all of the advice and the commentary and the observations and the analysis that Eric talked about in the last 40 minutes or so, I want to come back to a couple of fundamental precepts. And that is number one, you can never get a complete picture of what your third party's security operations and controls and procedures and stuff are, unless you perform some level of assessment against them, some level of security assessment. And second, that typically happens periodically. Maybe it's once a year, maybe it's upon contract renewal with a particular vendor. Maybe you have it set up to happen more frequently depending on the criticality of that vendor and how they interact with your systems and data, and whether or not they're touching private data, whatever. But with those two fundamental principles in place, that understanding or getting a picture of what a vendor security procedures are, and filling the gaps in between the annual assessments, I think we can agree that conducting that activity can be a colossal pain. They're probably spreadsheet driven. Maybe you have a solution in place. Maybe you're using a GRC tool. Maybe you're using a security scanning tool, something like that. But chances are, it's probably spreadsheet driven, and you're emailing it back and forth with vendors and third parties. If the program's a little bit less mature or less sophisticated than some of the larger ones, there's a lot of risk in that. Manual effort, manual work, you get the idea. But the outcome of it really is outdated data. And, doing some sort of a manual process where you're collecting intel via spreadsheet, or getting some, delayed scanning information on vendor security risks or cyber breaches or incidents or whatever, just introduces, more risk. Another challenge that we see as you begin to develop a program to assess those third parties on a more programmatic basis is that there's a lot of different people involved in the equation in any enterprise. Eric mentioned this during his conversation. IT or InfoSec is probably going to own the assessment process for third parties because systems and data are involved. But your procurement team is going to want to know some things as well. Are these folks, they have good reputation and a good financial history? What is their ESG stance? For example, that's a hot topic of today. Risk managers, the vendor management team, legal and compliance are going to want to know specific controls around how they protect access to data to address GDPR requirements, other privacy regulations, CCPA here in the States, and more. So it's a super complex process. What ends up happening is you get a lot of outdated data that really can't take good action on. You get all these different cooks in the kitchen, and we find that there's far too many people to try and satisfy in the process. So, moving on to the next slide, what our customers tell us, before they become our customers, when we're engaging with them in sales cycles, is that three things really end up happening with their current approach to third-party risk. First is they're always behind. They can't make good decisions, and they can't be ready for what's happening next or to be able to scale for the future. So, as we kind of move on to the next slide, what we offer is a very prescriptive approach to address third-party and vendor cyber risk across every stage of that vendor's life cycle or that relationship with you. I'm kind of very briefly walk through each of these 7 steps, very briefly, each one of these 7 steps. And I think it's interesting that Eric talked about how important it is to engage with legal and contract folks, while you are, assessing third parties or understanding the cyber risk posture of your critical partners, because that can inform, SLA and performance discussions. That can inform, metrics that you can, apply into the contract, and can help inform whether or not you want to, renew with these folks in the future if, their controls are substandard. So, from a for each one of these 7 steps of the cycle, as we move on to the next slide, sourcing and selection is typically the first step, in the process where you're trying to look for a vendor, measure their security controls, determine some inherent risk, and more. What Prevalent can do is help you by providing a repository of completed vendor risk assessments backed by real-time threat intelligence data. So we've got a library of something like 10,000 completed vendor risk profiles that you can, download on demand, review, and then incorporate into your own, sourcing and selection decisions to say, okay, these guys have good controls around this area. They're a little weak here. We may have some further review to do. Once you've made a sourcing and selection decision based on what you find in that library or repository, we automate the intake and onboarding process. So whether you build it through an API connection or upload a spreadsheet or distribute an intake survey around the organization, we can help you consolidate all of your vendor information into a single repository so that everybody is looking at the same data. That's the critical takeaway here. Everybody's looking at the same system and the same data and making decisions based on that same data instead of looking at a bunch of different siloed tools across the enterprise. And third, after you've kind of found your vendors and onboarded them, you score your inherent risks. We provide an automated inherent risk and residual risk scoring mechanism, which will then help to dictate what path you go down in terms of assessing the vendors in the future, what types of questions you want to ask, what you want to do with the answers, and more. And then fourth, assessing and remediating. And we've got a library of 75 plus pre-built questionnaires, a custom questionnaire option, and then all of this stuff flows into the single risk register with built-in remediation guidance so that you can say, okay, these folks have this particular risk. We recommend X, Y, and Z action. Like I mentioned a minute ago, it's all moot if you don't have any real-time intelligence. So those periodic assessments are essential, but a lot happens in between those assessments. So we thread in, continuous cyber, reputational, financial risk indicators and information from, 567,000 sources or something obscene like that. And that all feeds into the risk register and helps you raise risks and adjust risk scores dynamically and make good risk decisions from there. Next is measuring SLAs and performance. We've got mechanisms in the prevalent solution that helps you define what your SLAs, what your KPIs and KRIs are going to be with your vendor, and then measure progress toward those. Now, what's great about this is it's completely transparent to the vendor as well, and they can see, where they're living up to their expectations, their contractual expectations, where they might be falling short. And again, legal, procurement, security, risk, all these teams have access to this information that kind of unifies all this together. And then the last piece of the puzzle here is offboarding and termination. That I think is the one step in the vendor lifecycle where there just isn't enough discipline applied. When you start to kind of wind down a business relationship, there's an awful lot of things that have to happen from a contractual perspective. Is data destroyed, our connections eliminated, our accounts deleted, all this information, all these tasks have to be completed. We help to automate that in your relationship with your third party so that, you can come back and then prove to the auditors or, demonstrate after some sort of an incident that, no, you followed all the proper processes. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the outcome to this is, I would argue threefold. Number one is, with the different intelligence that we provide and the comprehensiveness of the platform, we just help your organization be a little bit smarter in how they approach the assessment and the monitoring of their third parties. That discipline and programmatic approach is fully automated throughout the life cycle. So, you can see where your vendors are at whatever stage, of their relationship with you, what tasks need to be performed, who owns what, and then what the risk is and what reporting looks like as well. Next, it's unified. We bring together a lot of capabilities as well with the whole objective of knocking down silos and making this, a solution that's sticky for not just you, security, but also procurement and legal and other teams. And more importantly, prescriptive. The worst thing that we or a vendor like us can do is just throw a solution in your direction and have you kind of make it custom and figure it out yourself. So, we've been doing this for 17 years. We've got a lot of prescriptive guidance built into the solution and help and, remediation recommendations based on, what we've seen before that can help guide you, through this process. So next slide, please. Honestly, that's all I wanted to share with you today. From my perspective, just a quick commercial on Prevalent to let you know that, everything that Eric talked about today is, implementable, actionable, and available in the Prevalent platform. And, we can really help you add some discipline, some rigor, and some automation to your third-party assessment process to really make some of those cybersecurity defenses real.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Eric. We have some time for questions, and we have some that came in throughout our presentation. So for the next few minutes here, if anything comes to mind, if you have any questions for Dr. Eric Cole or for Scott Lang regarding prevalent, please take a moment to use the Q&A function, and I will make sure they get relayed. So I'm going to ask the first question. I think this is for Eric. This came up as you were speaking. How do MSP and MSSP offering fit into your vision of not giving anyone complete access to a network?
So once again, it always comes down to the data flows and the design. So when you're looking at a managed system security provider, yes, they do need access to logs. They do need access to information, but do they actually need access to the actual databases and data stores and data information? And to me, that's that fine line that's missing. Is I can go in and give somebody all the visibility into the records, the accessing it. And many times you can even filter out so there's nothing sensitive in it. But that's a lot different than giving them full access to the database, the data stores, and all the information. So I think we got to recognize that when you're looking at a server or a system, it's not all or nothing. There's a lot of different levels of granularity, and you need to say, okay, they only need this, and then limit, segment, and reduce it. And the good news is all of this functionality is built in and available in most of these solutions. It's just nobody turns it on because it requires a little more work.
Thank you. And I know a few people have to probably hop off as we get towards the end of the hour. So I'm going to quickly put up one of our last poll questions. And I thank you all again for hanging out and with us. So our last poll question, are you looking to either augment or establish a third-party risk program in 2021? Take a moment. Yes, no, I'm not sure. We are here to help, as Scott mentioned. So I will leave this up as I ask one of our last questions, I believe is for Eric as well. Okay, and they mentioned they like the network segmenting at target, excuse me. The firewall must have some traffic open. So does the segmenting really keep other corporate zones from a spreading breach, since port 443 and some others are likely open to designated internal IPs?
So there's two levels. When you're looking at a traditional firewall, yes, you're talking basically ports and IP addresses where it's all or nothing. But when you're looking at a lot of the technology out there today, you can go a level deeper. You can actually go in and look at what's actually flowing over that. Is it really the transactional data for SSL, I think we said 443, or is it an attacker tunneling over that protocol? So today we want to go a lot deeper and not just say, well, we're trusting the port. Look at the data, look at the flows, and make sure that's okay. The other thing I would say is I would push back on that, because I'll often get from business units and entities, I need. And in reality, you want, right? Do you really need that access, or is it just something you want to make life easier, right? It's a discussion I have with my kids all the time between need and want, right? They're quite different. So I would also push back when vendors or other entities are saying, I need to have all this access. Is it really required, or is it just a nice to have?
Thank you. So it's all the questions I've had so far from the audience, and I'm leaving that poll question up. So if you take a second to answer and let us know, what you're looking to do, we're here to help. As Scott mentioned, we want to help you get on the train at the train station. Actually, as Eric mentioned, instead of in front of the train when it's coming at you. So we're here to help you do that. So if you do have any questions, you'll see here on the screen, there's info@prevalent.net. You can reach out to us there, or follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Also myself, Amy Tweet and Amanda Farina, my colleague, we're happy to connect you with a product expert if you're looking to dig a little bit deeper into how we can help you. Is there anything else from Scott or Eric here while we have you on?
No, nothing for me. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, great. I really appreciate both of your time. I learned a lot here, and I'm sure everyone else did. Thank you, everyone who joined us. I think one last, so the slides of where it will be shared and recorded, and this whole session was recorded, will be sent to you first thing tomorrow morning if you did register. So this will be at your disposal. But thanks again for everybody joining us today. We did learn a lot. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Scott. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Mm-hmm.